purpose of Teen Tales is to collect stories about life in Pemberton. And one of the stories we're always looking for is how do you make a living in Pemberton? But Anna bravely has agreed to tell us all about her experiences coming back to the family farm. So Anna, though you're a newcomer in Pemberton, you're also kind of like an old-timer because of your family history.
Yeah.
So could you tell us how it is that you're related to W.C. Green, who I always see mentioned in the history book because I think he lived forever, and Bussy Green, who was the first school teacher in Pemberton.
Yeah. So my W.C. Green was my great-grandfather, and Bussy was one of his daughters, and his other daughter, Anne, was my grandmother. So, and my dad is W.C. Green's grandson. So, and it was actually W.C. Green's aunt and uncle that bought the first land in our family up here that included the farm that we're on now.
And what the little white farm that's right on the corner, is that W.C.'s?
Yeah, that was the homestead.
Okay.
And that part, it's still in the family, it's in Bussy's family,
Okay.
that farm.
You were telling me earlier you grew up in Vancouver. Can you tell me how it is that you came to the idea that you would move back to Pemberton and start farming?
Well, after I got out of jail, I was working in Vancouver. I went to school in Vancouver, and for, I don't know, most of my 20s I hardly came up here. I'm sure Mom can fill in the gaps, but I didn't come very up at all. And I was working for Capers in Vancouver. I was a food service manager down there. And one day, Mom and Dad came in, and they'd been running the farm for a few years. By then it was up and running, like making a living and everything, and they were working really hard, and they came in and they just looked like I felt. Super tired, worn out, just done. And they still had another market to go to, and I think they probably still had deliveries, and then they had to go home and harvest the next day. And I just had this moment, this revelation, like, what am I doing? I'm working my tail off for it was a wonderful job at Capers, and it gave me a great background, but I would much rather work like that for my parents than for,
If you're going to work 7 days
if I'm
a
going
week.
to work like that, I was a total workaholic, I'm going to go and do it for my parents. And so I think I asked them, but I may have told them that I was coming. The first 5 years I still went back to the city. This was in '99, and I went back to the city every winter and worked again at Capers.
What do you think prepared you in your previous life in the city? What would have prepared you for your life now as a farmer?
We were brought up to Pemberton when we were young, and we always had to do work. There was, we got to play lots, but we also had to, help out.
There was work between the
There was
play.
work between the play, or it was made part of the work. It was still quite interesting, and my dad was quite something with 3 girls. Like, he didn't hold back on anything. Like, we helped him split fence posts and operate the tractor, and I mean, he just included us in everything, so we got the full experience. And we often spent time at our neighbor's farm, and he too, Don Miller, and he let us do all kinds of stuff. Agriculture was just, it was around. It didn't seem like a weird thing for a person to get into.
And I think it's interesting that you worked for Whole Foods, which really became quite the trend in the city, especially, I guess, since you moved back here. Whole Foods has taken off.
Well, Whole Foods bought Capers, and Capers was the original store. And so when I was working there, it was still Capers, and I mean, they're wonderful. They do what they can to buy local food. They buy our potatoes now. I mean, they're a huge company, and they buy our potatoes and put them in one store, because that's all we can produce for them. I mean, they would sell our entire crop in 5 minutes.
Wow.
They have such a huge business. But Whole Foods has been wonderful, and I'm so glad I had the experience to work there. And I think they're really working hard to be able to buy local food. It's quite a thing for a store to buy local food from individual farmers. It's so easy for them just to get the truck with everything on it, just one delivery, bomb it out on the shelves.
And then how did you end up writing a column for the local newspaper?
Well, I think I just wanted to try it, because I felt like I had quite a bit to say, and often when I was working I would imagine I would sort of imagine writing about things, and I'd have an idea about something, and I'd sort of have in my head, so I just sent one to David Burt, the editor at The Question, and he liked it. So here's what I think about modern farming, based on my experiences on the family farm. I remember visiting my great-grandfather in the Squamish nursing home. He lived to 104 and had been farming in Pemberton full-time since the 40s and only stopped operating a tractor in his 90s. I grew up in the city, so I absorbed a fair amount of Pemberton culture as a child through him, my grandma, and of course my dad. For example, there's such a thing as a Pemberton dialect. They say Pemberton and battery and potatoes. They all talk this way, and I don't, but I recognize it. I also remember my grandma and great aunts talking about how when in Rome, do as the Romans, but in Pemberton, do as the Ronans. The Ronans are one of the oldest families up here. Old Jack Ronan kept diaries, which are now in the provincial archives, and Molly wrote the Pemberton history book. A very influential family even now, who always get their potatoes in on time and never get caught with hay on the ground in a rainstorm. Anyways, when we visited him, often after a weekend in Pemberton spent fencing, stick picking, gardening, or hanging out on the neighbor's potato farm, Great-Grandpa always asked, "How are the potatoes?" Looking back on it, I don't think I had the impression that he was asking with regret that he couldn't be out there himself. I think he just really wanted to know how the crop was looking, and now I've been doing this for a while, I can relate a little bit. I would be asking with relief that I no longer had to do any of the work or take on any of the worry. But I would really like to know how that crop is doing. Are they planted? Are they up yet? Cultivated, weedy, flowering, irrigated, hilled, set with lots of tubers, sizing up, ready for harvest? Good volume? Are they selling? Are they storing? Are they tasting good? He brought his young family up here to Pemberton in the early century to homestead the land his own aunt he had purchased during the railway land boom. It was assumed that the railway would head north instead of east at Pemberton and go over the Hurley. When the railway turned right instead of left and carried on up Anderson and Seton Lake corridor, my great-great-auntie was left holding a parcel of mosquito-infested swampland that contained the land we're farming today. Devastating floods and lifestyle hardships drove the family off the land and they returned to the city. I think so the girls could go to high school. They returned for another try after great-grandfather got really ill, and this time he didn't leave until he was over 100, and he was never sick again a day in his life. My grandmother, Dad's mom, stayed in the city to go to high school, perfectly happy, I gather, she never saw Pemberton again. She was under no illusions about idyllic farm life. In those days it was a tough life. The summers were just as hot and even more buggy than they are today, and the winters as long, damp, and cold. And add to that the trials of pioneer life: no electricity, paved roads, telephone, four-wheel drive. My dad was born in Braylorne, as his dad was a dentist up there. Later his family settled in Vancouver, frequently visiting the farm in Pemberton. We have a lot of pictures of Dad on tractors, pulling potatoes, helping his grandfather, who must have been so thrilled to have this eager little boy visiting. Dad's dad obtained our parcel with the idea of starting a farm, but Grandma was not at all interested, so we gave Dad the keys to the chicken coop that never had chickens in it, and that's where we stayed on weekends and holidays until the house was built. There was an old Ford tractor in the barn, along with a disc cultivator, a mower, and a plow. Great-grandpa donated his planter and harvester, and Mom and Dad took it from there. It was a little bit old-fashioned. We replaced Great-grandpa's harvester in 2005 with a 1950s-era farmall tractor with a harvester attachment that had already been retired by 3 farmers before us, and it was not exactly a flying leap into modernity. It belched smoke and was wretchedly loud and jerky. The crew was draped all over it as we tried to get as many hands as possible on to help remove the potatoes from the dirt, and it broke down with depressing regularity. When the brand new harvester came to our farm in 2007, I quietly cried. I knew that Mom and Dad intended this beautiful, modern, perfectly enormous and complicated piece of equipment to be used for generations. That's how we roll. I took this as a message: this farm is here to stay. If it was me lying in the home care bed, over 100 years old, it would be very satisfying to hear about the potatoes from that eager little boy now saddled with eager little girls of his own. Pemberton dirt on their hands, Pemberton potatoes in their bellies, and their necks still warm from the Pemberton sun. Agriculturalists recognized early that Pemberton's dirt lent itself to root crop production. Some combination of receding glaciers, flooding rivers, and erupting volcanoes created topsoil teeming with the nutrients necessary to grow large, healthy crops of potatoes in particular. Not too many areas of the world still have soil like this, and if they do, I wonder if they also have no rocks. because there's no rocks in our fields and convenient gravel deposits can be found here and there along the original riverbeds if you know where to look. The weather is a benefit too. In the summers, you might have noticed, the valley turns into an oven that accelerates growth. The soil is moist well into the hottest weeks of summer, and the high water table means deep-rooted plants don't need irrigation all year. Historically, it's rained at least once every month, and we didn't feel the need to irrigate our potato fields until 4 or 5 years ago. Sometimes in our fields we find caches of tin cans and old metal shovel blades, which we think must have come from old logging camps. In one field, we often find bits of porcelain from an old homestead cabin. And a few years ago, Dad was cultivating a new field and he came across a piece of metal that he couldn't budge. He dug down further and further and further and found more and more metal. Finally, he plucked it from the ground using the tractor loader, and it was an entire wagon chassis, rusted and bent from years buried deep. It couldn't have been more than 100 years old, and in that time it became buried in 10 feet of silty loam. In terms of industry, the area's crowning glory was its isolation. The mountain ranges between Pemberton and other growing regions has made the migration of harmful bugs and viruses all but impossible. The seed potato industry was born out of the recognition that it was possible in this valley to produce seed tubers that are completely virus-free. Potatoes, for all their hardy reputation, are very vulnerable to disease. Commercial growers found out via the Irish potato famine that fresh seed stock and varietal diversity are essential to growing in volume, and Pemberton provides both. And even though the area is perfect for potato production, the agricultural land base is not big enough to compete with the 1,000-acre fields of commercial potato crop production in other areas. It is, however, an ideal amount of land to produce seed for the commercial growers, the volume of which can multiply 15 times with every generation. And the lack of land base is a major reason why my parents did not go into the commercial seed potato production business themselves, although they were encouraged to do so. Renting land would have been a necessity to accumulate enough acres to maintain a 3-year rotation of at least 20 acres, which is pretty much the minimum amount of land to pay for everything as a seed potato farmer. Plus, they wanted to be organic, which was greeted with a fair amount of horror among the conventional growers, who feared that the unprotected organic fields would be a magnet for terrible viruses. We have a good amount of land to grow organic potatoes for the fresh farmers markets, along with a bit of our own seed stock with a 5-year rotation. Okay, so with the history out of the way, we can now talk about the modern farm. And I do think there would be some who would dispute the notion that we represent the modern farm. It is easy to get the wrong impression about organic farming from the fact that it's often paired with phrases like back to the basics, the old ways, how it used to be done, anti-technology, etc., etc. In truth, we're quite modern in every way, except we don't use GMOs or any synthetic chemicals intended to provide nutrients that should already be present in the soil or to kill pests and weeds. Admittedly, and we've been hand-weeding the carrots lately. Also, our root houses were built with log walls and dirt floors, as that was a good way to cool potatoes back in the day, and it was also an affordable way for us to do it then. We don't use treated fence posts, so we split our cedar posts ourselves. We pick our own sticks and ride our bikes to get to the other side of the farm. And here's another place where I get a little bit old-fashioned. I love to hang out with other farmers, discussing equipment, cultivation, and potato growing. The organic industry is guilty of discounting conventional farmers because they use chemicals. However, in my experience, they possess not only a wealth of farming knowledge and experience, but a love of the land and lifestyle that is much stronger bond than the chosen methods of weed control. That being said, we strive to be able to afford sophisticated farm equipment and irrigation and cooling systems. Our tractors built within the last few years feature all kinds of helpful technology, including air conditioning and many times the horsepower Grandpa had. Old-fashioned tendencies apart, the farm is operated by a woman approaching middle age, that's me, her parents and her sisters. Is that old-fashioned? I'm sure I never heard about a management model like that before. And as I wrote this article in the fit of absolute modernity, I Googled how many words in a 20-minute speech and got an answer. Not surprising, as I've also learned about welding on the computer, replacing the spring and the starting mechanism of a chainsaw, and building a woodshed. Grandpa did not have this resource. Basically, if anyone accuses me of being too modern, I haul out my Pemberton History of a Settlement book and point to equipment and cultivation practices that are around today on our farm. On the other hand, and this is a lot more likely, If I'm accused of being old-fashioned, I lash out with horsepower, high costs, and computer-controlled pressure regulators. One reason that we don't use much scientific technology concerning the seed or soil on the farm is that there hasn't been much organic farming research pertaining to us done at universities or by government. There's a few private institutions that do studies, the most famous being the Rodale Institute, which is conducting the longest running side-by-side field test of conventional versus organic cropping systems. I think it's in the 25th year right now. The organic yields began outstripping the conventional yields several years ago. It's not even a contest anymore. And I think the reason that not much research is done is that we as an organic industry don't make much money for agricultural companies. On our farm, for example, we annually purchase cover crop seed, rye, clover, grasses, and mustard. And we pay what feels like a large amount, but is really a relatively small amount for tractors, equipment, and fuel. But we buy little else. A farm this size farming conventionally would be spending thousands of dollars on fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. And in this scenario, I wouldn't have a job. We don't put much money into the agricultural system, so it's not going to put much into us. I think our farm is a curious mix of old-fashioned and modern methods and values. It's hard to slot us into a particular type of farm. We're a fixture at the farmers market scene in Vancouver, which is getting big, and our fellow farmers there hail from all over southwestern BC. We belong to organic and biodynamic grower organizations that include many different kinds of operations right across the country. We belong to the seed potato industry here in Pemberton. We have 7 varieties in the lab, which is the most of any grower, although our farmed acreage is the lowest by a factor of at least 3 and as much as 15. Most importantly, we're farmers in Pemberton, part of a community producing seed potatoes, organic and non-organic mixed vegetables, blueberries, beef cattle, strawberries, dairy pasture, farm gate agritourism, to say nothing of the distillers, bakers, and coffee roasters in the area. It seems obvious to me that Pemberton is on the cutting edge of modern farming. We know from our history that anything short of mangoes thrive in our unique growing climate and superior soils. We have a 4 million person market 2 hours down the road. We have skilled farmers with generations of experience to draw from, and imaginative and courageous new ones willing to give it a go. Pemberton seems to present an answer to the big question: what is the future of food? Will it be GMOs and monocropping, or cover cropping mixed farms? Proponents of both methods debate the question of who will feed the world, but that's had an answer for ages now. People who used to be able to grow their own food are now without enough to eat, and it's not my style of agriculture that's the problem. We have certainly seen how not to feed the world. I don't think for a minute that Pemberton is going to feed the world. I would be embarrassed to suggest that we could do that. In most countries, the people have only been off the land for a matter of years, not generations, as is the case in Canada. Most of them know exactly how to grow what they need to eat and sell, and one day the tables are going to turn perhaps, and they'll be feeding us. North America is short on water, good dirt, and farmers that know what to do. The alternative to monocropping, government-subsidized mega farms, are a multitude of small-scale free enterprisers trying to grow as much food as they can for people who want to eat it. Feeding the world this way means you can't develop farmland anymore, and your food bill is going to increase. It also means government healthcare spending plummets, crime drops, and more kids pass aptitude tests. There are studies and experience that show all this to be true. And in our corner of the world, it doesn't matter if you're an old-fashioned or a modern farmer, it's what the consumer wants that matters. And more they're looking to Pemberton for good-tasting, well-grown food. It's going to be interesting. I think you should grow your own lettuce.
Yeah.
End.
With being organic and all natural, but basically doing one crop, even though it's different varieties. How do you do crop rotation, or leave fields fallow, or rotate that, or?
Yeah, we have a 5-year rotation. So each field is 7 or 8 acres, and we have 5 of those fields. So we get potatoes. The field that has potatoes this year we'll be harvesting in the next couple of months. And then we'll plant fall rye in that field, because that will grow over the winter. The grass and clover won't grow. So if we put fall rye in there, then it'll grow. And then we'll plow that up in the spring and plant the permanent cover crop, so grass and clover. And that'll stay for the next 4 years. And we've just started haying 1 field a year in that rotation. So a different field. And that's been a bit of an experiment, because that's 20 tons of organic matter just gone. and organic matter is kind of it's the building block. So that's an experiment that we're trying. Well, the question is, how can we farm in the winter so we don't have to buy frankenfood? Well, there's Simone, I bet she figures it out pretty soon, behind you at Root down there. That there are ways of doing it, and there's a guy named Elliot Coleman who's done a lot of research. He's in Maine, so it's a similar sort of climate, but I don't think they get quite as much snow. The challenge is that even if you have a greenhouse, you get a lot of snow, so you have to somehow manage that, or it'll just crush the greenhouse. And then of course we go down to minus 30 or whatever, so you have to heat it. But I just know there's some clever little person out there, and it's probably going to be one of the existing farmers. That was the point I was trying to make, is that the conventional farmers that are, for sure they're using chemical fertilizers and everything right now, but they are the ones that they have a lot of equipment and they have a lot of skill outside of the chemicals. And they also have parents that were probably farming without them, and certainly grandparents. So they do have a lot of knowledge, and I wouldn't be surprised if, like Kearney's, I wouldn't be surprised if they figured out how to heat a greenhouse over the winter. The reason I said that everybody grow your own lettuce is because lettuce is sort of, to me, it symbolizes one of the hardest things for a farmer to deal with, a lettuce farmer. Like, if you're usually doing a whole bunch of other vegetables along with the lettuce, and it has to be cut in the early morning when it's nice and cold, and then it has to be washed and probably sorted through and bagged, and then it has to be stored. It needs to be just crispy, nice, or people won't buy it. So at markets, when it's hot on a day like today, you can maybe put one bag on the table that just dies, so it doesn't look very nice, so nobody buys it. Like, it's a heck of a lot of work. And so, but it's such an easy thing to grow. It grows in cracks and
Yeah. And how do you manage the flipping of the fields? Because you said you can't grow potatoes in a field more than, or after 1 year, you have to leave it fallow for 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, well, that's his department, field management. So every field has a number, and then there's, so right now I think we're in field 3. So right now field 4, which is next year's field, has been in grass and clover for 4 years. And we mow it regularly, like 4 or 5 times a year we mow it, really chop it up. And then that's organic matter that's just it's rotting into the soil, and this whole process of biological activity takes place with that organic matter. And then in the fall, so field 4, in the fall we're gonna rotivate that and probably plant some fall rye on top of that, because you don't really want to leave bare dirt, because anything that's in there is just going to leach away with all the water. So we'll plant fall rye and then till it up in the spring and put potatoes in. And meanwhile, this year's field is going to have whatever it's going to have. It's just, there's always something going on all the fields. So we don't really say fallow. That's not, because they're not just sitting there not doing anything. They're sitting there like busy getting ready for potatoes again 1 year. So they're in various stages. Every field is a potato field. It's just it may or may not have potatoes in it.
And do you let livestock graze on a field that will eventually?
No, well, we only have 2 cows, so in terms of ranching, we haven't really gotten our feet under us there yet. Yeah, cattle, it's a bit of a balance, right? Because if they're on a field too early or for too long, they'll chew that grass right down to nothing, and then it won't grow very well. So, and they do, deposit their manure, but if you've got too many cattle on, it's a net loss of nutrient. With just the 2, we're safe for now. But we did have cattle. Our neighbors ranged their cattle on the potato fields when Mom and Dad were first starting the farm, and they were advised to not do that anymore because it wasn't helping the field at all. It was too many cattle for the size of field. We'll start with 2 and see where it goes.
Is the 4-year rotation, is that a policy of yours, or is that standard for all kind of organic potatoes?
Yeah, it's our policy, 4 or 5, but it is standard. I think even like big, huge commercial table potato people let their fields go for a couple of years, like have a rotation. Potatoes, like after the potatoes have been in the field, you just look at it and you can see it's done. Like, potatoes contain everything you need to live, except for vitamin D. So, and they get all of that from the soil. So they've just drained it, just taken it all away. So it's kind of dust and it just needs to be left alone. It just needs to grow some stuff and rejuvenate,
But
even a conventional field.
The seed potato farmers do it, what, every other year or?
They're every 3 years
Every
mostly.
3, okay.
There's a couple of them that are even more than 5 years. Joe Ronan, I think he was 7 years or something. He thought we were skimping with the 5. Yeah.
You didn't mention the spraying, which the other seed potatoes growers do, and that's one reason why you get yours out before the end of July, right? So you don't have to spray for aphids or anything else.
Yeah, well, we get them out because when Mom and Dad started growing organically, they had to make an agreement with the seed potato growers that they would cut all their tops off by a date. And that was the deal if they were gonna grow organically, because the seed potatoes, as I said, they were horrified at this organic, ridiculous granola thing. And so, and I think they only let Dad do it because Dad has roots here and has history, and if it had just been new people, I doubt it would have flown like, and there's provincial legislation that sort of gives them a fair amount of control over the area, seed potato control area. And we're very conscientious, like if there are aphids, because that's the big concern, is aphids are the vector for the disease, the blight that they're very concerned about. So if we see aphids, or if the inspector starts seeing aphids in the valley, then we cut our tops off. We just end it right there.
You just use a hay cutter to get your tops?
On 7 acres? No, we have a mower behind the tractor.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I meant.
Yeah, that would take a long time. That would be old fashioned.
Is there a flowering stage that would give you an idea of when the best time to take the top? Because different varieties flower
Yeah.
at different times, so.
Yeah, it totally depends on the variety. Like the Pontiac, if you've got those red ones, they're ready, they're generally ready, or ready to be looked at, I guess, once the flowers have started dying off. But then the Sieglinde, like, are flowering merrily and starting to die now, and we're not gonna look at them for weeks.
Yeah.
So, it just depends on the variety. There's 35 varieties in the lab right now of
Wow.
potatoes altogether.
And where are they being shipped?
Well, all over, like, I think some went to PEI this year, but that's an unusual shipment. A lot of them are California, Oregon, Washington, Alberta,
Idaho.
Manitoba, Idaho, that was the state I was trying to think of, yeah. There's a few other seed potato places in North America now. For a long time, Pemberton was the only one that could produce virus-free seed. But there are other places now, and so for a while there, Pemberton farmers were having to compete with some pretty big fields. But then something happened, all these other diseases started turning up and all these other seed from all these other places, but not Pemberton. So we buy like 10 other varieties in addition to our own seed. We'll only grow our own seed if a seed grower up here won't grow it anymore. But we would much prefer to get it from one of them.
But if you buy it from here, it's not an organic
That's right.
seed, that, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So, but that's okay, you can still grow it organically and call it organic
Yeah.
potatoes?
And we're actually not permitted to buy seed from anywhere but Pemberton as part of the seed potato control area.
So is there any organic seed that's being sold?
Well, Bruce Miller sells organic seed, but he's doing the same thing, buying from conventional farmers, planting it and then selling it
The seed?
as seed. And then we produce our seed for certain things, but it always starts in a very conventional environment in the lab. I mean, that's growing salts, agar, white sugar in the solution. So that's where it's starting. So and I don't know of a non-organic way of doing that. I don't really like to malign the conventional seed growers here, because if we didn't have that seed, we wouldn't have potatoes. And now that I've seen these other diseases that have turned up in our, like, we see people with other potatoes at farmers markets and they've gotten their seed from somewhere else because it's cheaper, and their potatoes look like crap. They're all marked and how come my potatoes are rotting? Like, I don't know, where'd you get your seed from? Like, and they got it cheap from some other place. So I mean, it's not treated seed, so the stuff that we buy, but it is from their conventional farms. But seed doesn't get treated in the root house up here or anything like that. So I think the last chemical it has is the top kill chemical, which hopefully they'll stop using, because now Bruce is not using it anymore, he's using his flamer, and it's working really well. Although it did start a few fires, but that's okay.
And my second question is are all the potatoes hybrids now, or are they, how many, what percentage of potatoes are hybrids?
Well, they're all sort of hybrids,
Yeah.
because they're, I mean, the original potatoes that were in the Andes, they're really, like if you saw them, you wouldn't recognize them as potatoes. They look like sweet potatoes, but knobbly and different colors, and then it's just, I mean, potato breeding has been in process for hundreds of years, since potatoes sort of got to Europe. They've been, well, in the Andes they did it too, but and that's different from GMO. There's no GMO potatoes in Pemberton. I don't know that there will be. It just isn't working for the developers of GMOs. So potatoes also make a berry that looks like the tomato, and if you planted that, you'd get throwbacks to all the different varieties that went into that one variety, including like grass and all kinds of stuff that went into it. But potatoes are unique in that they grow exactly to the seed that was planted, to the piece of potato that goes in the ground. It doesn't, you know, like sometimes you plant a squash seed and something different happens. Potatoes aren't like that. If that's a Pontiac potato that goes in the ground, those are Pontiac potatoes that'll be growing. Yeah.
But you're not, when you're producing in the lab, you're not using that method, you're using actual seed.
No, we're using little plants. So we sprout a potato, and then we cut it up and we plant it in the agar, and that sprouts. And then we cut that sprout up and plant it in agar, and then they all sprout. So your seed propagation is what we're doing. And then finally you've got however many little plants you want, in our case 150. And then we plant those into plug trays. So they're little plants like that, just into the dirt with plug trays, and they grow up, and then we plant them in the field or in the garden. It's not a very long row with just 150. Then we harvest those potatoes in the fall and save them and plant them the next year, and then harvest those in the fall and save those, and then plant those the next year, and then that harvest we sell. So it's actually, you know, a 3 or 4 year process between the lab work that's done and the cash crop that comes later. And that's seed propagation. And you sort of multiply 15 times every year, roughly.
And do you, to get your seed, do you kill that sooner so they're smaller, or do you?
No, with seed we want it to be as big as possible, because we can cut it into smaller pieces. So it's nice to have a big seed. Yeah. Ideally, I mean, it is easiest to just have them all the same size, but that doesn't really happen all that often. Any other question? Oh,
You
Mary.
mentioned the horror early on of organic farming with the others in the valley. So years later, how are things with the millers and the organic potato farmers and the
Yeah.
non-organic potato farmers?
Well, it's pretty good now. I mean, we've worked hard at it. Like I volunteer at the lab, so I help like keep all the varieties going. We bought into the lab, so we're helping the lab. The industry is growing because of us now. I don't know, we're all,
Does this add to the expense then? Is this why the organic potatoes are working more expensive because of this extra handling and?
definitely, what, you know, like our seed generation, so our seed that's just come out of the lab and gone into the field, we'll be lucky, see you going, we'll be lucky if we get, 2 pounds on a plant of potatoes. Like that would be thrilled with 2 pounds. And a conventional grower would be horrified with less than 5 or something. Like our yield on our crop is somewhere between 3 and 5 tons per acre. And if we ever, in some varieties, sometimes we hit 10 and we just, I mean, it's chills and thrills. And if they get less than 18, they're like, it's the end of the world. So, I mean, it's mainly a yield issue. We have to make the same amount of money, or we'd like to net the same amount of money, but we're doing it with way less yield. And then, you add in things like the hand weeding of carrots, for example, and it gets up there, for sure.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Anna.
you, thanks
you.
guys.